Thank you for tuning back into the DDT Method podcast. I'm Drew Donaldson, and this week I'm sitting down with Mr. Dom Kuza. Now, Dom is one of these guys that a lot of coaches will go to for advice when they're stumped by something to do or what to do with a certain situation with their client. And the cool thing is, he's not really a guy that specializes in one facet of everything. We were just talking before the podcast started recording about how this conversation is likely going to go in the direction of training, nutrition, PEDs, health supplements, female pharmacology, and every which way, because this is somebody that's legitimately done it all. And he has a phenomenal coaching platform that has a lot of information that we'll give you guys some info on later in the podcast if you want to tune in and get some more. But let's start out from scratch for the few people that might not know who you are. Dom, give me a little bit of background. Like, who are you? Kind of what brought you into all this, and how did you evolve into what you are now?
Yeah, so I was always into fitness, but I originally was going to become a dentist. I applied to all that, was waitlisted at a school and everything, and then decided to not pursue it anymore. So then I went and did my master's in exercise science at Oakland University in Michigan. And then in our program, we had to pick something to specialize in. And then I chose physiology. So that I did all my specialty work in physio. And then I did a couple classes at the med school we have there. We have like advanced medical physiology that we were allowed to take classes with them. So then I did all that work at school. And then went into personal training, started online coaching while personal training, and that kind of took off and eventually left the personal training scene. But I did that for a couple of years. And then now today, I've been like coaching and training for about 10 years now. And it's been quite a long journey, but it's been a really good one. And it's been a lot of fun too. And now most of my businesses, I still do a lot of health coaching and bodybuilding prepping and things like that. But majority of my business now is actually education consulting. I work for Revive. I work for Raw Nutrition. I do product formulation and education for those two companies. Relive Health is one of the companies that I also work in. I'm kind of like my role is advanced clinical educator. So I teach a lot of the NPs, PAs, doctors, the client advocates, how to do certain things and how we can apply certain knowledge to clients there. And then I have a whole platform for educating coaches, like you were just saying. That's a big thing that I do now is a lot of consulting for coaches, just to help troubleshoot stuff. But it's been awesome. It's been great. And I thank you for having me on. I've been watching, so it's awesome to be here.
And let me just say, and we'll swing back to this at the end. So your platform with all of your modules and all of your information, again, we'll talk about it specifically at the end. But guys, you're going to be taking notes on this podcast and you're going to learn a lot. If you learn a lot, or should I say when you learn a lot from what we're about to get into, please know that there is probably one of the most extensive coaching courses that I've ever seen that this guy put together. And if you've been watching for this long, or if you've been watching the podcast for a while, you know that I rant about all the continued ed stuff I've done, and I was a little bit blown away by it. So looks like a fantastic set.
I have a very low ego, and that's just not who I am, but I strongly believe I probably have the most extensive education platform that's available today.
I certainly believe it for damn sure. So let's dive a little bit into some of that education, and let's see if we can teach a few people a few different things and maybe shift a few paradigms today. Let's start out talking about nutrition. So in the coaching world, we have probably 10,000 different approaches to building a nutrition plan at the very least. Now, 1,000 of those might be right, or they might be beneficial for the client, but there's probably about 9,000 wrong ways to go about it. So if you have a client coming to you for any sort of purpose, if they're coming for bodybuilding, if they're coming for general population, getting lean, building muscle, how do you go about the process to building the perfect diet for that client?
So I would say one thing that I do like to do with green clients, so people who I've never worked with before, I'm the coach that actually likes to potentially start with food a little bit on the lower end and feed up if I need to. That's, I think, a little bit of a safer place to start with than overfeeding too high at the start. Because I do look at it like you're not just trying to target things nutritionally at first, but the adherence needs to be in a position where it can be really consistent. And that's why I feel like with a little bit of a lower food approach at the start, you get that adherence a little bit quicker. just because it's not like the crazy sheer amount of volume of food. Because a lot of people will do like, body weight times like 15, and then they'll just start people there. I think for a lot of people that's unrealistic because it's just too much food for them. They're just not used to eating that much food. I think majority of people who hire us, in like the lifestyle world, the general population world, they eat a quarter or a half of that. And to get them to try to do that on day one is a very hard thing to do. So I always start on the lower end with people and then kind of feed up as the weeks go. And really, that first month, I'm really focused on just habits, just getting them more habitually into a schedule, into meal prepping, into things like that. That's why when I start with new clients, I always tell them, like, if you get 80% perfect this first week, that's great. I'm not trying to get you to 100% right away because that's really unrealistic thinking. And I think when you put that expectation on a client right off the bat, you're almost setting yourself up for some failure, because if they don't achieve it, they start to feel bad, and then there's more setbacks that end up happening. So I like to kind of coach from that aspect, where every week, let's just get 5% better. After the first month, you're at 100%. But it's a little bit more of an easier way to actually get a client started. And that's how I've always coached, and I still do that to this day. Like, I just had a new client sign up today. And when I go to make their plan, it's going to be very similar, where it might on paper look like enough food for them initially, but eventually I'll be able to just reverse them with feeding up instead of going from too high and trying to have to figure out where to lower at that point.
Now, how important is variety in terms of what they're picking from? Are you giving them strict plans right off the bat to kind of build that ability to follow a plan, or are you mixing up the micronutrient intake with variety of different foods?
So, I'm a big believer in setting up new clients on a meal plan. I'm not a fan of macro tracking for new people. And the reason is, I think when you give people too much autonomy in that direction from the start, they have a hard time of understanding like how to build a day's worth of food out, because you're just giving them kind of free reign. I think if you wanted to do macros, which I think I don't have nothing against it, but if you wanted to do macros, I think what you would need to structure is like macro amounts per meal, and then give them that kind of guide to just help them build some structure, because that's the number one thing they need is structure. And that's what I think meal plans do so well with. But I do try to keep like, the first meal of the day different, last meal of the day different, and then in between maybe have some different variety meals. But I always give a very extensive like food swapping chart that they can just, make very quick swaps. Like, I do the math for them. Like, if there's this much rice, there's this much potato if you want to swap. They don't even have to do anything. They just have to do that. Veggies and fruit are always like it's a big table that they get to pick from, and they're all measured out at X amount of carbs. So like the fruit amount, it'll just say, pick a fruit amount, and then they just pick from that list. All those fruits I listed are all 15 grams of carbs, let's say. So then they can just pick one of those. So I do include variety, but I like the structure to really be set for majority of it, because I need to help train their mind in a way that they can make this happen throughout the entire day, every day. Where I think macros off the rip don't do that.
So it's almost like a structured variety. I like that, because it's rotating foods are given the option to do that, but it's still putting them in the best position to follow and adhere to the plan to a T, I should say. Now, here's where it gets interesting. How does this approach change for a new client that's, let's say, an intermediate level or beginner that's had some potential, a little bit of success, physique competitor, any division, male or female, because that's a whole different world, because now we're going for an extreme. How do we go about, like, first of all, what are you seeing with people coming to you? Because there's a lot of preconceived notions that are less than ideal. What are you seeing coming in? What do you usually have to change, and how do you get that competitor rolling?
One of the things I usually see a big problem with coming from either self-coaching or from different coaches is the lack of actually fruit and vegetables in diets, which I understand. Like, not everybody likes eating vegetables, but like fruit is something that I think everybody should be eating every day. And we can get great micronutrient profiles from eating fruit every day. You get fiber from it. Like, that's such a low-hanging that's low hanging fruit to actually include in your plan. But that's a big mistake I see a lot of the time. And then really low fat diets, like to where it's like trace fat sometimes, where it just doesn't make sense to me on paper. I mean, I know there's the whole crowd that argues like if you are an anabolic user, you don't need a ton of fat because you're taking anabolics and yada yada. But I don't really believe in that, and everyone can believe what they want and do what they want, but that's not how I coach. And I like to have good amounts of dietary fat. I do think it's very helpful. So that's like those are the two things that I always have to fix. And then what else I would change is I'd probably be able to start with more food, especially if they had a diet that they were on, and I'd be able to see what that was, start kind of near it or maybe a little bit above it. But I will always do the food variety thing. I mean, most of my clients get that option until like 7 weeks out. And that's when I really take the variety swapping away. So that's, for majority of my clients, that's always something that they're getting.
I feel like keeping that variety in as long as possible is probably your best bet for avoiding any sort of like dysbiosis or issues coming up as far as digestion goes, or really just general health from missing out on micronutrients or getting too much of something else. But like you said, I think narrowing it in at a reasonable 6 to 8 weeks out, that's kind of the time to dial things into bodybuilding mode, so to speak, in terms of doing things that way. And I think to touch on the low fat thing, that's another example of people taking an approach that might be beneficial short term, like a week or two, maybe a couple days at a time where you're going trace fats. And for some reason, this tends to get applied as like, oh no, this is how you diet. And then before you know it, you have coaches misinterpreting the purpose behind something and they're running 12, 16, 20 weeks of trace fats. And I understand the whole argument about, well, if you're using anabolics, et cetera, but if you're trying to make the argument that you're going to synthesize your cellular membranes from trenbolone, then I would argue that you have bigger problems or bigger things coming.
Yeah.
So there's a ton of issues and a lot of it's misinterpretation. What are some other things based on diet that you're seeing? And obviously we're not going to name names because we have no idea what camps these are coming from, but what are some of the biggest misconceptions for extreme physique enhancement and bodybuilding prep style diets that people are coming in just that's making your head spin?
I still see a lot of like pro veg approaches where it's just like protein and vegetables only, which like, listen, man, I've prepped like that personally and I've had to do it to make weight and whatever. I think it's very situational, like this amount of time situational. But I've seen it where like people have that like almost programmed into their carb cycling schedule. Like it's you have a high day, a moderate, a low, and then a pro veg. And they're almost like cyclically doing that for weeks on top of weeks. And then what I see happen is that's really, if you run that for too long, it's really hard to get out of those dietary holes that you end up in with, filling back out, with getting dietary stress off of you to continue fat loss. You see a lot of people try that approach and then they end up stalling really hard. And it's just because you've accumulated so much stress and so much fatigue on the body by putting the body through like a diet like that for too long, that you're going to have to almost diet break to get that person out of all that stress that you caused on them. That's one that still shocks me. Like I could see the use of a pro veg approach maybe a couple days out from a weigh-in if you needed to, if you were like really over your weight cap or something like that. Again, I think there's application based on context, but it's more like this long-term stretch of just including that. It's pretty extreme in my opinion, and unnecessary because I don't really think you need to do that.
Right. Now, what are some approaches that you take earlier on to kind of set the table for success to avoid that situation that some coaches and athletes find themselves in where food is already ultra low, maybe carbs have already been eliminated, cardio is really high, and then they're trapped in this place where they think they just have to eat less and do more until they're doing 6 hours of cardio and eating ice chips for breakfast? Like, how do you avoid getting into that situation?
I always, and something I teach a lot too, is be as aggressive with your dieting on the front end to start being able to refeed as quickly as possible. That's something Matt taught me a couple of years ago, and it's something that really has helped me a lot with a lot of preps. And it's something that I do teach all these coaches now is at the start of prep, be really aggressive out the gate, try to get fat loss and weight loss as quick as possible so that you could start refeeding as fast as possible. And you won't end up having to do a lot of that, because you get a lot. What I think a lot of coaches do and why they end up in those positions too often is because they're too soft off the rip, and they don't push fat loss hard for a while, to where then they end up playing catch up midway through prep, and they end up having to press really hard. So my rule of thumb was always be aggressive out the gate, and like, dude, I'm telling you, like, if I got a guy 5,000 calories off season, good base of food, we're probably cutting food to 3,700 week one. And I want to see the scale plummet. But then once that plummeting stops, I'm going to bring in your refeed right away. And then what I usually do is bring it right back in at the starting food point. So like that 5K or maybe even higher, and then bring that into the cycling. Most of the time, we're still 15 weeks out, and you're now refeeding at 5K plus cals once or twice a week, which is a great spot to be in at that time of a prep, because then you don't end up having to push really, really hard later on.
100%. No, I think that's a great approach. And it's something that almost guarantees, well, maybe nothing guarantees, but it sets you up to not have to scramble at the tail end, like you were saying, when stress is at an all-time high. Now, another thing that I think people tend to make mistakes about, either in programming for clients or putting together their own training, is not matching their training up to their nutrient intake. Maybe things are mismatched, and maybe they can make it by for a little while, but eventually that's another cause of massive amounts of oxidative stress on the system that'll lead to a complete stall in progress. What are your thoughts on the best style to approach training with? And do you change it based on if food's high or food's low? How do you mitigate damage by that?
So as prep stress accumulates, and let's also just stop for a second. All this stuff about prep, you could apply to hard fat loss phases just in general. So like even lifestyle clients, general population, like if you're just in a hard cutting, like this is all the same applicable stuff. I start to shift my high days to non-training days, no cardio, low steps. I actually shift the highest amount of calories on days where you're going to expend the least amount of calories, which I find helps a ton with recovery. And then try to pair that with the day of the weakest body part to follow. So like if it's a guys whose arms need to stay fuller throughout the prep because it's one of their weaker body parts, we might be doing a rest day the day before that day, and that's the day you're having the most food. And then you're going into your training the next day because you're now nice and fed from the previous day's food. I've always been a big believer in this concept of like you train on a lot of yesterday's food. You don't train on so much of today's food. A lot of it was yesterday's food. Now, obviously, there's fast acting sugars and stuff, but I think you get what I'm saying with like glycogen and things like that. It's a lot of what was done the day before than so much the day of. And I always tell coaches and I always tell other athletes, like, do you feel better the day of your refeed or the next day? It's usually the next day. Your training the next day is usually way better. And that's why I like to really take a rest on those highest days. But I don't usually start to do that until like we're, like you said, like deep in prep, stress is high. They can't really get by anymore with just pushing through.
Right. Now, do you ever change the style or the stimulus of the training? Because I've seen on your social media, you do a lot of not bodybuilding training yourself. Yeah. Now, do you ever incorporate things like systemic metabolic stimulus to a bodybuilder or different phases of training? Do you ever do something that's more or less demanding on glycogen or more or less inducing of hypoxia? Do you ever change the training style in the middle of a prep or extreme fat loss phase over the course of, let's say, 20 weeks? Or do you like them to train the same style the entire time?
No, I have them train the same style. What I'll eventually do later in prep just to help with time in the gym, because I do know mentally that's one thing that a lot of athletes towards the end of prep just kind of want to get in and out of the gym. They don't want to be there for 2 hours. I'll start to shift like multiple working sets, maybe over to one working set with some sort of intensifier just to speed things up, get them out. I might switch compounds from like free weight stuff to machine based things. So, taking like an incline barbell press to a plate pin loaded machine now or something like that. Warm-ups less time. You're able to put intensifiers now on those because it's now the risk is a lot lower where we can save some more time. So I'll shift intensity over a little bit and maybe movement selection towards the end. And that's only if they need it. Some guys are fine throughout the whole prep and they can push through. But I'm also a big believer in keeping it steady, keeping it consistent, allowing intensity to be a major driver of making sure that we don't have a ton of tissue loss too. Because I do think that a big reason why you keep tissue as best as possible in a prep is because of your ability to stimulate it.
Makes perfect sense. And one thing that I always say, and you did mention that you started out in the personal training world, the best coaches have worked with people in person.
Oh, you're going to say exactly what I've always said. Yeah.
1,000%, because that's the only thing, and I don't want to turn this into a old man shits all over TikTok thing because I tend to do that. But you have everybody that's, and regurgitating ChatGPT is another problem, but you have people just reading and regurgitating information that have zero skin in the game of their own and little to no skin in the game with anybody else. So you don't have a concept of that N of one, different people react to different things. So keeping in mind that everybody is different, what would be your generalistic approach to the best way to train in a prep or extreme fat loss phase? What's the type of volume? What's the type of frequency? How do those things correlate? Like, how do you like to set that up in general?
Great question, because I do, like you said, generally speaking, I'm a lower to moderate volume coach with just intensity. Like our relative effort's very high. Most sets are taken to like a mechanical failure. Maybe not to the point of like forced reps or anything like that, but mechanical failure for sure. And then that's my general rule of thumb, is probably like 1 to 3 sets, relative efforts very high to like a RIR 0, right? RPE of 9. That's kind of where I'm at. But then, because I think this is important to say, I also believe, and I've seen it work really well. Maybe on paper it doesn't make sense, but in practice it does. People who lack the relative effort ability, like who can't take themselves to those RPEs of 9s and 10s and those RIRs of 0s, I make up that lack of relative effort in volume. And I might add some more sets to those people because the way I talk to people is you have fundamentals of hypertrophy. Tension is one. Well, guess what? You can't just always do the heaviest weight because then you're just not, your time under tension is not there anymore, meaning reps, right? And then your volume is the one other, and then relative effort is another huge one. But the problem is like now with relative effort, these people maybe mentally can't take themselves to that point of failure all the time. We have to make up for that lack of stimulus somewhere. That's where I think the volume comes into play, where you can lean into a little bit more volume. I use the silly analogy of like muscle building is just evolution. Like if you had to run away from a lion once a week, you're not going to get faster. You're just going to get smarter. If you had to run away from a lion every day, you're probably going to do both. You're going to get faster over time and you're going to get smarter over time. So we have to meet that stimulus threshold, like everybody knows, at some point. And I think with the lack of relative effort, you can make up some of that with volume.
1,000%. I'm literally sitting here like fist bumping as you're saying that, because I'm literally, you're saying it, you're leading up to it. I'm like, he's going to say volume. He's going to say volume. And as soon as you said it, fuck yeah. I've been ranting about that for so long. And that's part of the reason why I have all new clients. They basically have to send me videos for form check. One reason being I can just say, hey, like try this or lean this way or protract at the shoulder, et cetera, whatever it might be. But the other thing is I'm paying attention for how hard they're working, because I'm not going to arbitrarily send out text messages, voice memos, and videos telling everybody they have to work hard and kill themselves. I'm going to judge how hard they're working based on the effort that I see in the set. And if they're not generating enough intensity, I'm keeping in mind, okay, XYZ person needs XYZ volume to make up for the fact that that set is nowhere near the other guy's set that looks looked like he was going to burn the whole gym down with the effort that he was putting forth. So
Yeah.
I love that you pointed that out, and I love that you articulated it like that, because I think that's something that could help not only other coaches, but a ton of people out there that are training, because some people just have issues generating that balls to the wall intensity, and nobody wants to talk about it because the climate of the internet is, I
You're
can't
soft.
generate intensity.
Yeah.
And then, oh yeah, you're a pussy, quit, go do something else. It's like, well, no, because we've all had workouts that have clicked, and we've all had workouts that haven't clicked. If it's not clicking more than it's clicking, we're going to have to make up for that. And there's no shame in having and being able to admit that. So like, again, it's just like, I could rant for about 20 minutes about how awesome I think it is that you said that, because not enough people bring that point up or even address it because they just want to dismiss it. Let's start to get into some of the fun stuff, because people like the low-hanging fruit in terms of, I can go out and buy this and use this. But let's start a little conservatively. What do you think the basics of supplementation should involve? And I'm asking that not only to you as a coach and an athlete, but as somebody that's doing formulations for a company that knows you guys need to put together products that work.
Yeah. I think like basic stuff that everybody should be taking. I think everybody should be utilizing some form of like D3 and K2. Even if you live in places like Florida and Texas, plenty of people, we still do spend a lot of time inside, even in places like that. And you might not get enough sun exposure to actually start the process of good vitamin D levels inside of your body. So that's like number one for me. I think omega-3s are great, and you can do omega-3s in different forms. You can have really good, omega-3 supplements that are out there for that. I think EFAs, because a lot of people also, like I said, might trend towards, lower fat diets. We might be missing a lot of essential fatty acids. So omega-3s would be another really big one. CoQ10 would be a huge one for me. That's one that I do think a lot of people could benefit from. And then, multivitamin, multi-minerals, I do think your diet should cover a lot of that. And that's why I'm a big proponent of fruit. I do have all my people probably eat fruit maybe 2 or 3 times a day. So I do think that those should be covered as best as possible. Obviously, in situations we might need to use them. And then from there, I think that, to me, honestly, actually, no, I would add magnesium to that list too. People do not, we train so much and so often, you don't realize how much magnesium you deplete through. Magnesium would be a huge one to take, and taking different forms would also be helpful too. Glycinate everyone associates with sleep, but then there's things like taurate, there's things like threonate, there's other magnesiums to take that could be also really useful. But magnesium would definitely be one that I would say like every day. Like if it's the end of the day and like I don't want to take like all my supplements because it's a lot, like I'm always still taking my omegas, my vitamin D, my magnesium, and then my CoQ10.
Now, what about stuff in the peri-workout window? And let's kind of glaze over carbs here, just because. Oh, well, that counts as both, I suppose. But let's say let's talk a little bit about creatine, and let's talk about things like maybe your glycerols, your EAAs, things that can aid in that kind of peri-workout window without too much of a focus on carbohydrate, just based on the fact that we all know that that's going to be beneficial for some, not as beneficial for others. So let's go peri-workout supplements, creatine, and then kind of when to introduce a peri-workout carbohydrate.
Yeah. So creatine, I think, would be on that list of supplements too. I take 5 to 10. I take 5 grams like maybe 2 to 3 times a day, right when I wake up, and then I do 5 grams while training, and then depending on the workout's intensity, 5 grams after or not. And then, so my master's thesis was all on EAAs. It was on like muscle protein synthesis, but all the focus was on amino acids. So I think EAAs are phenomenal products to take. Now, there is a huge camp of people that say, like, if you eat enough protein, then you don't really need to take them. But I do think both anecdotally and on paper, there is some good efficacy behind taking EAAs. And I think the blend of a good high protein diet with EAA supplementation, we know EAAs can stimulate muscle protein synthesis without the non-essentials. But then we're getting that through complete proteins that you're eating, and then also our body's making them, right? And a very important thing that a lot of people need to understand when it comes to amino acids is you have to keep a continuous pool of amino acids available in the body at all times, because amino acids are not just used for muscle protein synthesis, right? It's not just for muscle growth. You use amino acids for, you use amino acids for like the BH4 cycle and for other things in your body that you need those amino acids to be used in to have an outcome elsewhere. So I do like EAA supplementation for that purpose. I also am a big fan of, and some people will say this is a little out there, but if you don't like to eat before you train, drink amino acids while you work out, which is a great way to kind of negate muscle catabolism if you don't like to eat before you work out. I don't eat before I work out, and I work out like, this high intensity endurance stuff now. It's just because eating before I train now is just almost too heavy, and it doesn't feel comfortable when I'm training. So I just have a loaded drink while I'm working out. It might have like 20 to 30 grams of EAAs in it, and I'm sipping on that while I'm training. Sometimes it has carbs, sometimes it doesn't have carbs, and that's always been a really good option. Another thing that we're huge in too, which I think a lot of bodybuilders also forget about, is I'm really into the endurance world now. And with Raw, we launched our endurance line last year, so I'm working more with a lot of Ironman people, and marathoners and stuff like that. And I've learned a lot about sweat and how much sodium and electrolyte loss is in sweat. I do think a lot of bodybuilders miss out on replenishing sodium properly. And that's peri-workout window, something that we should be harping on, replenishing after hard, sweaty sessions, sodium right away. That's definitely one thing I think a lot of bodybuilders mess up with.
No, I agree with that 1,000%. Now, as far as carbohydrates go, is that something that you're introducing earlier on before carbohydrates get low and then you're pulling them? Or are you kind of moving those carbohydrates into that peri-workout window as they're coming down elsewhere? Do you like to condense towards the workout, or is that something completely independent of how you run your peri-workout nutrition?
So personally, I think a lot of bodybuilders overuse intra carbs. And the reason I believe in that is just because of heart rate consistencies staying elevated in bodybuilding training is not that high. I think certain bodybuilding workouts, really hard leg days, really hard training days that you're, pushing, could call for the intra carbs. But I don't know if a beginner bodybuilder really needs intra carbs for like a performance purpose. I think you could get away without it. But I do see it very useful. Now I'm going to flip it though, because I do see it really useful being paired with essential amino acids, because we do know the hyperinsulinemia, so the elevated insulin that happens from the carbs, actually really drives those EAAs. So now we're using it more synergistically with the EAAs, not so much that you're purely depleting your glycogen while training and need some carbs to get through it. That's always been my notion with intra-workout carbs. And then I do utilize them if I'm using insulin with the bodybuilder, which,
Right.
That's more of like a safety mechanism, making sure that, blood sugar stays stable throughout the workout if they had insulin earlier in the day. That's how I've always done like intra-workout carbs for the bodybuilders.
Now, in the non-exogenous insulin using bodybuilder, you said that generally the carbs are, they're being used, but they might be being used too much. They might not be needed. And you mentioned heart rate with that. Is that because in most bodybuilding or hypertrophy-based workouts, do you feel the heart rate's not going high enough to drive a high enough demand for glycogen? And is it something where maybe those would be incorporated in more of like that metabolic stimulus, but not a traditional bodybuilding workout?
Yeah, so this is where it gets tricky though, because it's like, I feel like if you or I were to be training in hypertrophy settings, like our heart rate probably does get high enough to deplete a good bit of glycogen. But then there's guys where they might rest longer than they should and they're moving slower, but they're drinking 50 grams of carbs while they're training.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is when we look at when we look at the charts of like substrate usage with like carbohydrates and with fatty acids, we know it's very like VO2 max heart rate related. So a lot of bodybuilding training, like in easy arm days, you're not pushing thresholds to the point where you're just like blowing through glycogen like people think you are. Um, that's why it's, I don't know, it's a touchy subject because I think there's guys that can use it and get away with it and be completely fine with it. But then I think like the less educated are overusing it, wasting money and maybe even wasting calories, to be honest. And, you know, not just, not getting the best gains or not getting the best use out of it.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree 1,000%. In fact, this is probably the part of the podcast where everybody watching is getting mad at me for stalling on talking about drugs because I'm a nerd for energy systems. So when we start getting into like, at what point are we using glycogen? At what point is this recovering or that recovering? I'll start rambling about that one. But I do want to get to what people want to hear in addition to like the deep dive nerd shit. So let's talk drugs. So let's look at everything from that kind of extreme fat loss bodybuilder lens, because for the most part, everybody watching this wants to be jacked and tan and look like a bodybuilder. So we'll kind of use that as the lens that we're speaking through right now, just so we can cover more ground in one similar topic. And we'll do this kind of for men specifically first, and then I want to touch on women. But let's say intermediate level bodybuilder comes to you. You obviously talk to him about what he's done in the past. You're charting out a course for a show that's let's say 20 weeks out. How do you go about mapping the perfect course of drugs for that client? How do you go about selecting what you're going to run your testosterone base? Are you going in the 19-nor DHT direction? What ancillaries do you need to run, if any? When are you running blood work? Like, how do you build it and how do you plan it out?
So I usually build like a couple weeks at a time, obviously, because things could change. But I also do think it's good to have a nice timeline set so that they know what to buy. Just because I mean, my biggest pet peeve is like when I say like, all right, add this, and they're like, oh, I haven't ordered it yet. I want you to have everything. So like I always do a shopping list and like roughly how much they'll need and stuff. That way they're prepared ahead of time. But usually what I do is I'm a big fan of higher tests. That's just what I believe in. I think it works great. I think test is king. So with my test, it's usually at the threshold that they can handle without an AI. If it's somebody I've been working with, I kind of know that at that point. But if it's not, then that's something we're going to have to troubleshoot for the first couple of weeks and see like with sensitivity in like their nipple or things like that and get a gauge. We could grab like an ultra sensitive estradiol too really quickly just to see what that's like on a certain dose. But usually my test is at the point where they can handle the estrogen it's aromatizing into without an AI. And then that's where the test will kind of sit. And then I'm a fan of Masteron. I'm a fan of Primo. I'm a fan of EQ. I'm a fan of Tren, MPP, all of it. I don't really use MPP or DECA in preps. I usually use those for more so like anabolic phases where I'm really just pushing growth. But I usually start prep with something like Test and Mast, and that's usually what we do for a few weeks. And then we'll slowly introduce other compounds like Tren, more so towards like the point of where now the stress level's so high because Tren is such a good compound at helping with cortisol and like corticosteroid, like corticoid receptors and things like that. So I think one of Tren's best traits is its ability to help you retain tissue. So when the gas is flowing hard and you're pushing really hard, I think that's a good time to maybe bring in Tren. And I've, over the years used less and less and less Tren with people to the point now where like I had all these guys compete at junior nationals last weekend. And I think the max, out of the 4 guys that competed, I think the highest dose one of those guys was on was 125 mgs a week, which is pretty low. But I think that's a good use. And then I like Winstrol. I like sometimes I'll use Proviron just to help with like SHBG, but Winstrol kind of covers that for us pretty aggressively in itself. I do use Nolvadex pretty often just to help compete against receptors, because we do know that if we are dealing with some excessive estrogen, that can blunt lipolysis on fat tissue if that does bind to the alpha 2 receptor on fat tissue. That could, make fat loss a little bit more difficult. So I do like Nolvadex for that purpose. That does work pretty nicely. And then a big shift that's happened over the last year, 2 years ish. I'm using way less Clen with people because I'm utilizing things like Reta and SLU, and a lot more preps. Like 2 of those guys that just competed didn't even use Clen. They just used SLU with some Reta. And then the other 2 guys, I don't think used over 40 micrograms of Clen.
Nice.
And, if you wanted to if you go to my profile, you could see like how all those guys were peeled. So those were really good tools that, have, been put in the toolbox now and I use pretty often. AIs I'll start to use maybe around like the 6 weeks out mark and start to bring those in a little bit just to kind of see, okay, what's water, what's fat, and, what hormonal shift I can have with lower estrogen, and see kind of what the physique looks like once we pull some of that estrogen water off of them. And I'll start building that up around like 6 weeks out and then kind of ride it in. I'm also a big fan of long esters. Tren is the only one that I'll keep short, but I'll use long ester test the whole prep. I'll use long ester mass the whole prep, because I'll usually start to taper the test down as we get closer to like 4 weeks out. And then I'm usually pulling it completely around 2 weeks out. And that's just because you're on a long ester at this point. I want to reduce injection frequency. I want to reduce aromatization rates because every time you inject, there's aromatization happening. I want to just kind of reduce that. And then I do think it's just nice to be able to pull these injectables around like 7-10 days out and then just not have, any injection stress going into the peak week, but still have a very adequate amount of the compounds in the blood still.
Right. Totally agree. Now, let's definitely dive into Reta and SLU because I want to talk about those as much as possible. But before we do, let's touch a little bit on the basics of building a course for a female. Now, there's a lot that goes into this, and I'm going to shout out the interview you did on our mutual friend Tom's podcast, Tom Schuster. So I'll link to that in the show notes here because that was a phenomenal deep dive. So for the intents and purposes of this episode, what are the basics of building a course for a female? What do you like for them to use? What's the relative dosage, frequency, duration? But again, it's got to be kind of in general because everybody's different.
Yeah. So I'm a big fan of always assessing testosterone and doing TRT first if needed, because I think that alone can change the path of a female very fast and very quickly, and is a great place to start. And then what I usually do is try to keep like first exposures to like a 4 to 6 week window. Obviously, like lowest doses possible, like 2.5 to 5 milligrams of like Anavar, for example, for like 4 to 6 weeks. And then whatever at a minimum is always time on equals time off for females. That way we get a good break. I always notice that like virilization, yes, I do know it is dose dependent too, but I do think even more it's like the time exposed to the dose. Like if we're taking that and now doubling it, the virilization chances I've noticed have just grown exponentially. Even if it was the same dose, it's just you're on for so much longer now. So what I usually do for like a prep, if we had 20 weeks, I'd probably do like a little bit of a kickstart something for like 4 weeks, and then take like a 6-week break. That was the first 10 weeks of prep. And then I like to be exposed in that entire later half. So it might be like that last 10 weeks of prep, we're exposed to something going into the actual show date. That's how I've always written female PED cycles for preps. And that's what I teach inside of my school. But that's always been a nice way to kind of start prep off pretty well, take a good, break from any androgen exposure before you kind of finish up your prep.
Do you like to ever utilize non-virilizing PED options with women like growth hormone or even low-dose insulin, or is that generally off the table for them?
No, yeah, I've used growth hormone with plenty of women. I've used insulin with women. One thing I learned from oh my goodness. Oh, from Scooby, Jason Theobald. I was on a podcast with him. He had me on their podcast, and we were talking about insulin use. And one of the things that he said on it, which I thought was pretty interesting, was if you're working with a female that might struggle with pushing training intensity, one of the things that you could do is give some insulin to help with the pump, because now the mind to muscle connection is a little bit better. Because I don't know if you've ever trained with insulin pre-workout, but the pump you get is insane. And, and that's a good way to help with mind to muscle connection and just helping with intensity too.
Awesome. And insulin itself can be a whole other episode in general, but I've used it so much at this time, I kind of use it as the occasional pre-workout, whether or not that's responsible. But it is a gnarly pump, so I have a couple pens in my fridge at all times, actually. But do as I say, not as I do. Nonetheless, let's move into some of the cool new stuff that's out there. So let's talk about RETA first, because GLPs in general are changing the game for everybody, for general population, everyday people trying to lose weight, for people with chronic disease, and of course now for competitors and extreme fat loss enthusiasts as well. Retatrutide, in my opinion, is like the king. Is that something you agree with? And what are some of the things you've seen from it? Because it can be leveraged a ton of different ways.
Yeah, I think RETA is the king for fat loss. The reason I say it like that is because I've used all three that are available right now. And I've also seen with a lot of clients, and this is also something that we use in the clinics. We don't use RETA yet, but we use Semaglutide and Tirzepatide. But I would say RETA is the king at fat loss, I've noticed. I think Semaglutide is the king at appetite suppression. And then I'd say Tirzepatide is somewhere in the middle of the two. Semaglutide, when I took it, was to the point where I'd had to set a timer to remember to eat. Tirzepatide kind of dialed that down. I also didn't get nauseous when I took Tirzepatide, but I did when I took Semaglutide. We have to remember something, right? Intensity of these side effects is also related to stimulation of the receptor so aggressively. So, yes, like plasma peak levels are very included in that, but then we're also looking at the receptor stimulation itself. That's what's like the switch from on to off or from off to on when you take it. That's why the side effects sometimes are so unbearable right away. And that's why I think with like semaglutide, just GLP-1 activity like that, I personally see way more side effects with semaglutide than compared to the other two. And then Tirzepatide, like a lot of that went away. The appetite got a little bit better, but then the fat loss got better because of the GIP activity. Then RETA comes into play, and you try RETA, and you're like, okay, now we have three actions here. Is this too much? Is it going to be like too much stimulations and too much activity here? That was kind of the worry in my head at first, just because of abuse. I think RETA abuse could cause more problems down the line than abuse of the others, because let's face it, bodybuilders like to abuse everything. So that's the one thing I would say with RETA. Just be very weary of that, because you are, in nature, we're not meant to stimulate all these things at once like this. So we need to be mindful about that when using RETA, especially if you're trying to push higher doses over time and stuff. But I do think RETA is great because you get good, food noise control. You get good, in my opinion, I think some people get good compulsive behavior control from it too, which there's good research on that with the GLP-1s directly. And then with the glucagon stuff, you get great fat oxidation. And that's phenomenal for what we're trying to use it for in a prep. Like I was using semaglutide in people's preps like 2 years ago, and people were just like, this is crazy. Like, why would you use something? A lot of people looked at it like, you have to earn your stripes to diet. Like, you can't just take something to blunt your appetite, which I get. Like, are you enabling somebody's food relationship issue with something like that? Maybe they shouldn't be prepping. But if that's the case, then they shouldn't be a bodybuilder. They shouldn't be doing contest preps.
I never understood how GLPs are cheating, but hardcore anabolics are that's normal.
Yeah.
I mean, they're all drugs, man. I mean, they're tools.
So I really like the RETA stuff though, because we also see with Reta, with all these medications, actually, like inflammation control. You see cardiac health improving. You see a lot of really good benefits with these compounds that I think a lot of people don't. I think a lot of people who are against these compounds don't want to admit because when you think about these compounds, and I think this is where a lot of people have the misconception with these compounds is they think of them in the way of the general population uses them. So the normal titration schedule, the high doses that they end up reaching, and things like that. Whereas like in the bodybuilding world, you're using smaller doses and you're using doses that are even under the clinical trial start. You're not even at the start of the clinical trial dosing when some of these people are taking it. Like I start people on like a milligram of Reta a week. Like it's under the clinical starting dose, but it's enough for that person with their dieting, their cardio, and everything to get some good benefits, see some better fat loss, and more importantly, for a lot of these guys, they sleep better because they're not that hungry. That helps with the prep tremendously. So I think Reta's phenomenal.
Yeah, it is fantastic. And again, I've had people on the lowest dose possible, like 0.5 to 1 milligram for an extended amount of time. I myself have been using it since mid-December. My doses have varied. I've been as low as 0.5 milligrams for weeks on end. I went as high as I think 6 milligrams at the highest that I ran it, and it's been just continued success. I can still eat. I just don't overeat. I don't have that food noise, and my LDL dropped from 120 to 65. So it's one of those things where it's, oh, dude, everything. And everything was already pretty decent. It's just everything just improved even more. And it's just the massive multitude of positive effects that the drug has, but still very much a drug that has to be respected. Moving into the next category of stuff, we have the entire mitochondrial world now, which is exploding. And SLU and to an extent MOTS-C were the two that gained the popularity to really drive things in that direction. But SLU, in my opinion, has been another game changer. What's your experience with that one been? Like, what are some different dosages you've run with people? Is it kind of a general approach?
I think SLU is a great product. A lot of people call it a peptide. It's not.
Small molecule.
Yeah. So, I wasn't saying that for you. I was saying that just because like some people say like peptide SLU, and I'm like, well,
yeah. I'm pretty sure I just called it a peptide, though, so I'll call myself out on it. I might have. I don't know.
Okay. Well, that wasn't at you, but
all good.
with SLU, I think it's a very cool product. Right, we reduce dependency on glycolysis. You are better at fat utilization. We see a lot of ATP production cranked up with it. Some people get a nice thermogenic effect from it. They get a little bit warmer when they take it. I think SLU is great. I think SLU is also really good for like the world that I'm training in now because we get like type 2A fiber benefits from it, and we get the training endurance effects from it, which is a really cool factor of it aside from the fat loss stuff. That's really interesting. This is something that I've also used it for with some people is with creatinines and EGFRs actually, and using a small dose of it to help with EGFR elevations, which actually works. My cystatin C and EGFR. So my cystatin C was the lowest I've ever had it, which then my EGFR was the highest I've ever had it. I was like in the 130s, and like,
holy shit.
And that's with using my creatinine and cystatin C to calculate, which is the most accurate way to calculate an EGFR. So I've used SLU with a lot of clients. A lot of clients really like it, and I think they really like it because their preps are not involving as many stimulants as past preps have had to. Because I'm not using yohimbine, I'm not using a ton of clen, because the SLU is doing a lot of the work for us in that fat loss category, which has been great. Now, the one thing that some people talk about, I talked to Gorilla Chemist about this a little bit, and it was something that we talked about because I just didn't know if micrograms was enough. Because if you extrapolate, so like for everybody listening, when you read research, and we have research just on animals right now, you have to extrapolate the dosage they used, and then there's special formulas that we put together to figure out what the dose would be in a human. So there's a number per species, and if you take mice, there's this number. If you take rats, there's this number, and then we can figure out what that human equivalent dose is. And the human equivalent dose is actually like crazy high for what is available. So then that's like, okay, well, we're not going to take that much, but how much is too much, or are we taking too little? That was always something that kind of interested me with SLU at this point, because I've worked some people up to like 2 milligrams, which most peptide companies sell it at like 250,
Right.
100, 500. Now, the one thing that kind of pushed my rationale a little bit more was when Peptide Sciences came out with theirs. Peptide Sciences has been a really good company for a while, and they do a lot of really good education too. When they released their SLU, they released it in a 1 milligram capsule only. And that was kind of, to me, like, okay, are we taking too little? But if you're seeing results on 250, 500, do you have to go up? No, you don't. Just stay at that dose. You don't have to take more. But I mean, dude, I'll be completely transparent. I mean, I've taken as high as 10 milligrams a day.
Wow. Nice.
So, and done blood work on that, and that was completely fine. But the fat loss was way better. The endurance got a lot better. So there was things, but now I have to think about, did I potentially cause like too much mitochondrial activity? So now, Is there a lot of dysfunctional mitochondria? Are there damps happening? Do I have things that shouldn't be happening to the mitochondria because of the dose being taken? Obviously, I don't know. I need to test like TNF alpha, IL-6. I need to test things to see what that's like. So that's kind of the one thing. But then, there's proper things to do when you're on SLU. Like good things that I like to do is like urolithin A, CoQ10, PQQ. Like taking mitochondrial supporting supplements can be really helpful when taking SLU. And then SS31 is a good follow-up for SLU, in my opinion.
Right. Now, SS31 for the structural integrity of the cell, right? That's more of a recovery agent as far as the cellular processes.
Yeah, and then it also helps with mitochondrial integrity. So that's one of the things that when I finish up a SLU exposure, doing some SS31 for a few weeks is something that I like to do. Now, again, the thing with the world of all this stuff is we don't really truly know. Right? We're kind of still in an experimental world with all this. And that's why there's a lot of people that talk down on all this stuff, because there's people who have a thinking process where it's just hard critical evidence and that's the only way they can make a decision. And then there's people that are a little bit more open, right? And you can look that up when you study personality types. There's people that need the research paper in front of their face to say like, okay, I could take that. And then there's people that are like, well, theoretically, I could try it.
I think it all has to do with risk assessment, knowing what you're comfortable running, knowing how things work so you can make an intelligent guess as to how to build it. Like my own mitochondrial, I guess you could say, approach, it's probably way too much for most people just based on the fact that I don't care about spending the money on it, but I'll ramp my SLU up. I'll probably take some BAM 15 days at the end where I'm not taking SLU. I'll run all the support stuff. I'll run SS31 at like 5 milligrams a day for a couple weeks afterwards. I'll do a senescent cell clear out with some high dose Physique for like 2 days, and then I'll restart the whole process from scratch. It's kind of a lot, but I just think it's really cool. But I also think there's things you can learn from experimenting and putting things together in such a way and just knowing how they work that you can come up with a generalistic process or approach for other people. So maybe they don't have to do the 37 things that we do to optimize it. Maybe we do it and then we realize that they can probably get by with 1, 2, 3, but at least we have the option of suggesting this complete protocol based on what theoretically will work, based on what we know about how things work. In the peptide world, what are some other players that might be new, might be old, that you think people really could benefit from leveraging even more?
In terms of fat loss or just in general?
Let's go with fat loss first, and then maybe let's talk about some kind of generalistic peptides.
I think Matsia is great. I think Mod C is really good. The thing with Mod C is like it can get expensive just because, I usually start people on like 10 milligrams a week for a couple weeks and then dial back down to 5 milligrams. So like you're going through a vial a week pretty much.
Right.
And then it is a little bit more of a spicier shot. It does hurt a little bit when you do take it. So that's one of the things. But I've seen pretty good results with Mod C, especially if the fat loss issue is in regards to possibly some insulin resistance, just because now we're getting better glucose utilization and we're improving insulin sensitivity when using Mod C. So I've seen some pretty good results with Mod C in that regard. AOD, I've seen mixed results. Some people get some pretty good fat loss with it. Some people really nothing really changed, nothing really happened. But AOD 9604, right? That's one of the things that I see people use for fat loss. That's kind of been, like I said, both ways I've seen it. Some people respond really well to it. Some people don't really respond to it.
Now, what about in the world outside of peptides? Let's get into some more kind of gray area stuff that people may or may not know about. What are your thoughts on the injectable ATPs of the world, the injectable carnitines of the world, injectable choline? Do you like to leverage any of these things with physique athletes or more gen pop? And what do you use them for?
So there's a company, Better Through Biology. They sell some of these types of products. They have two products that I use personally, and then I use them with some people too. Iridescence is one of them. That's like cytocholine, phosphocreatine, ATP, things like that. And then and then DADA, DADA.
That's back there.
Yeah, I've used both of those. I use both of those personally, and then I use those with some people too. I think they work really well. Like I can always tell if I took my shot before I trained or if I didn't, and that, I mean, that speaks to a lot of like the effects it has pretty quickly. Data I usually only give to people on the hardest training days that they have. That's just because if we're looking at the way we want to utilize data, it's to support like the highest intensity. And because one of the really important thing when it comes to like mitochondrial stuff, energy production stuff, when you ramp these systems up, you want to match the energy demand. You don't want to ramp these things up and your energy demand's down here, because now that's where like a lot of oxidative stress happens. And then that's where a lot of like problems over time start to happen. So like, that's why like with data, I like to put that on like days I do like, I don't know, 400-meter sprints, like 10 rounds of that, and rowing at high speeds and things like that. So like where my heart rate's in the 170s for 40 minutes. That's when I'll take data. And then I give it to actually some physique guys that I know train crazy hard, like before a leg day. And I have them take it like before a leg day like that. I think iridescence is great. That's like a blend of like phosphocreatine, cytocholine. I think it's got ATP in it too. I like that one a lot. That one I kind of take either a half CC or a full CC like every training day. That's always been a great one for me. And then again, I'll utilize that on some of the harder training days for physique athletes. I think they work really well.
What are your thoughts on the injectable carnitine?
I'm just not fully behind it yet. I just, in practice, like on paper, I know how much sense it makes, but just in practice, I've had people commit to it hard and just like nothing really came out of it. Like nothing different really came out of it, which to me, it's like I've had people commit to like 600 milligrams a day for like 20 weeks, like the whole course of a prep. And I've prepped these people before, and it's not like anything really different happened or changed. But then I see, I do think there's outside benefits though. Like we do know carnitine is really good for like androgen receptors, and can help a lot with that. But like from a purely fat loss position, I'm just not 100% sold on it yet. But I do think there's really good health benefits to taking carnitine though through an injection, versus like orally. So that's not to say that I'm not against it. It's just like in a fat loss phase, I personally would probably be like, you know what, you don't really need to take it. That's just my opinion on it. But that's just what I've seen through practice with using it with a lot of people now.
And it does have a multitude of benefits. So if it's something that's not translating into the exact world that you're trying to translate it into, it makes sense to go another route with that. I do think a lot of those products serve their best purposes when they're performance-based or driving a certain action as opposed to a specific physique-based process.
100%.
So in a lot of cases, in a lot of cases, the applications of things like data and iridescence, and even if we're sticking with better through biology, things like their ITPP, the peak VO2 for more of an endurance setting, stuff like that, driving it to a specific action is always going to be key. What's some stuff that might be on the horizon in terms of newer performance enhancers, either performance enhancing drugs directly or gray area stuff, peptides, different injectables? What's some stuff you think people might be sleeping on? Maybe some newer stuff, maybe some stuff that's not so popular, but people can be benefiting from?
I think one that actually a lot of people don't utilize enough or maybe talk about enough is DSIP, the sleep peptide, which a lot of people I think steer away from those types of things because they think it's like knock you out right on, put you to sleep right away after you take it type ordeal. But, the way it works is it helps just with deep wave sleep. And it's not so much something that you take and like, within 10 minutes, you're drowsy and about to fall asleep. But it helps a lot with sleep cycling, which I think is a huge underlying issue as to why physique athletes don't have good fat loss sometimes, and why endurance athletes suffer with training recovery is sleep. And the DSIP, I think, is a phenomenal product that you could add. I've had a couple people use it now. To help with sleep. It's something I take to help with sleep, especially before like a big training session or before a race, for a competition, things like that. I've had a lot of these guys use it like the last couple of weeks of a prep just to help with their sleep and just to help with that. I think that's like something that is huge. I am a huge fan of Slenac and Semax. Semax, I think works very well, but with Slenac, however you say it, that's one that like I take every day, and I take before like work because it's anti-anxiety effects from it. It's not so much like work causes anxiety for me. It's just like when I have so much stuff to do, it just helps me kind of calm down to just get everything kind of situated and organized, which I think is a phenomenal thing to have. I have people take it before hard training sessions if they have like exercise-induced anxiety. Like one thing I learned really easily and really quickly through endurance stuff was like when your heart rate gets high, man, like it almost gets panicky sometimes. And that's just you responding to a high heart rate. It's not because you're running out of breath. You're just having a high. So that's like an anxiety thing. So taking a little bit of Slenac before I train on those high days, those high intensity days, I like doing. I've given it to people before a stage just to help calm them down a little bit. I think that's a great tool that you can use too. So I think those are two that, people are talking about them more, but I do think people sleep on some of those products. As far as new stuff coming out, Anthony and I were talking about a quad agonist that's coming out pretty soon. That should be pretty interesting with how that works. And then I do know these myostatin inhibitors are starting to, I don't know if they're available yet anywhere, but I do know that they're pretty close in human trials. We'll see how those work. I think those could be promising. The problem with myostatin inhibitors in the past was that they caused growth everywhere and not just where we wanted it to happen.
Yeah, somebody sent me a bottle of something a couple weeks ago, and it's one of the newer ones, and I'm like, I'll do it, but I'm going to wait till a few other people do it first. I don't like to be in that first line with anything, but I am intrigued as I'm actually looking at it right now. But nonetheless, some of those, I agree 1,000%, if not everything you just said. Slenac is phenomenal. David Herrera described it best I've ever heard in terms of an analogy for it, because I could never really put my finger on how do I describe this to people. And he said it's like drawing a cityscape on a whiteboard and then erasing everything except the building you're looking at. It kind of quiets the background noise. And I was like, shit, that is the perfect way to describe it. So that's how I try to explain it to people. It's dude, it blew my mind because I've been using it for like 3 years and I never thought to explain it like that. I'm like, oh shit. Well, that's why that guy's smart as shit. But that one's phenomenal. Delta sleep inducing peptide also. I'm an avid user of it. I probably use too much of it, to be honest. Do you prefer for both of these the injection or the nasal spray?
For Slimac, I do the nasal spray. For DSIP, I've only been using the injectable until recently. I actually just found a nasal spray. So I'm going to try the nasal spray. I haven't tried it yet. One thing that I do want to say that I think a lot of people sleep on, especially in the functional health world, are bioregulators. Because if we look at bioregulators, and real quick, I'm not going to talk about this for too long, but 2 to 4 amino acids long, tissue specific, can help silence genes, can help activate genes and express things, but they're designed to help a system and tissue get back to normal. They're not going to take you exponentially to a certain point like some of these peptides do. And that's why I think, like, I've dealt with people with like adrenal insufficiency on labs, given them glandocort alongside their other adrenal, and their adrenal glands rebound faster. I've given people Thymolin, I've given people Vesugen, I've given people, I took Cardilax for an injury I had, like pairing the Cardilax with the Vesugen to help with, blood flow and also to help with bone and cartilage. I think bioregulators are great. And the one thing I do love about them too is you do them for a month and you're done with it for a while, and then you come back to it when you need it. So those are definitely things that people sleep on, not just from a performance stand, but if you're a functional health coach and you work with a lot of just like functional health issues with your clients, those are tools that can be used really well to help people speed up their recovery on whatever you're trying to help them with.
Yeah, they are absolutely phenomenal. So, and the irony to this is I've actually been looking for somebody to do a bioregulator episode with. So maybe we might have to dial this back in the future.
I have an hour and a half lecture on it in my school.
Oh, damn. Ladies and gentlemen, like I said in the beginning of this, the fucking school has everything. Jesus. But maybe we do have to revisit this and do a bioregulators episode in the future because I run 1 or 2 a month and then take a month off. Then I'll run a different set. Yeah. So, I mean, they're a little pricey right now, but it's not that bad. And for what they do, it's worth every penny of it. It's not like it's something you have to stay on year round. So that is a whole other conversation. Dom, before we wrap things up today, man, this has been fantastic. I love episodes that have a lot of actionables, and we have like 80 sound bites here that people could just clip and be like, I'm going to go do that. So that's amazing. So that was awesome. If people do want a deep dive, how do they find more about you, more about your course? How do they find everything that you do?
Everything's on Instagram. So if you just at Dom Kuza, really simple. That's my Instagram. And there's a newsletter that you can apply to learn more about my course and the school. It's not really a course. It's more of hybrid mentoring because you get all the coursework that's self-paced for you, but then you get direct access to me through a chat, through a community wall. We do 2 calls a month through a group Zoom. So it's more of like a hybrid mentoring. I used to do only one-on-one mentoring, and then I used to do group master classes. So I kind of just took the 2 and put it together in one, to where now it's more self-paced, just because I know people need to go back and rewatch things and do it like that. So that's something that you can just subscribe to the newsletter. You could DM me about whatever you need to do to learn more about that.
Awesome. Everybody check that out. We'll have that linked in the show notes before. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been the DDT Method Podcast with Dom Kuza. Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you guys next time.